Okay, we're now going to be creating a storm. Starting out with the scene that you can see I have loaded in. You can load this in with the content that is provided, and it's called Landscape with Distant Terrains. Now, this is currently set up with 3 procedural terrains, one extremely large one in the back, which is terrain number 4, and then a terrain that is much smaller than that for sort of the mid value, and then another terrain that is just called procedural terrain, even smaller than that, and kind of a step down for each terrain. And then they do slightly intersect each other just to make up for any of the edges, so that the materials and everything kind of line up. Now, this isn't going to be the most efficient way to work on the atmosphere, because we're going to be rendering out billions of polygons for these terrains, and that's just not going to be very efficient. So what I want to do is create a lower res version of these terrains and another version of the scene just to modify the atmosphere, and then we can come back and then after saving out the atmosphere and load it back into this scene. So I am going to save another version of this, and I'm just going to call it atmosphere edit and then _01. So now I can pretty much do whatever I want to the rest of the scene, and I can always come back just really worrying about the atmosphere. But I still want the terrains in the scene so that they can interact with the atmosphere itself and the lighting, because it's going to be really important. So what I want to do is go through each of the terrains and basically just convert them over to standard terrains. So we can edit the object with the terrain selected, right-clicking, and now the quality, it's really kind of up to you how much you want. You could also clip down some of the terrains. For the most part, reviewing pretty much everything. For the closer up terrain, I'm just going to do 1024 by 1024. Go up to the top left, and we can change it from procedural to standard. Click OK. And then move our way through each of the terrains, keeping in mind their overall scale, and that we might need more definition in order to interact correctly. But for the most part, 1024 by 1024 should work fine to pick up most of the atmospheric highlights, because we have pretty much the entire terrain, or each of the terrains, in the scene and showing within the camera. So it shouldn't be any problems. Go through, convert those over, and now it is going to change the material slightly, but not enough to cause a major impact. We'll still be able to get what we need out of these terrains and get a faster render while we're working on the atmosphere. So I also want to start by loading in just the default scene. I have mine in a different folder, but you can go to daytime spectral sunshine, and it's going to be the default. I can just load that one in too. Now, I did kind of have the sun where I wanted it, and it did reset the position. I'm just going to change it back, but I guess it would be a good idea to pay attention if you go to the atmosphere editor under the sun tab, just kind of record those values in order to preserve the current look you have. So I'm going to reduce the pitch, and now that I can see the sun, I'm just going to go ahead and select it and turn on the point at camera option if it's not on. And this way what I can do is switch to the view mode, and when we move, we can just position the sun directly this way. So I'm just going to kind of move it back where it was before. Now, I'm pretty sure if we take a look in the atmosphere editor, go to the sky, fog, and haze tab, that the aerial perspective is probably going to be a little too high. If I just do a quick preview render, you're going to see mostly white, which is going to be the haze, and the thickness of the atmosphere. Really not able to see much because of that. If you are looking for that sort of look, then that's one way to achieve it. but I'm going to bring the aerial perspective down to 1. And if we also take a look, File Options, Units and Coordinates, I am using an internal unit of 1 meter. So overall the scene is fairly large. Reducing the aerial perspective now down to 1, huge impact. I am going to make a modification to the mid-terrain material. Whenever you convert a procedural over to a standard, the Z-scale height changes, which modifies the environment tab details directly related to altitude. So in this case, what I'm going to do is take this snow layer and just delete it. Not going to use it. And that way we can have a nice blend. Because otherwise it was just a little too off. And it's going to be hard to separate that from atmospheric lighting, the lighting effects on the overall look at the terrain. You'll also notice that we've lost a lot of detail because of how large the polygons are. But really, like I was saying, it's not going to be that big of a deal. So if we take a look at the atmosphere, I do want to make quite a few changes to these default settings. There's a few settings I've been using for this kind of a setup that creates a really nice looking sky. And what I want to do is take the sky mean altitude amount, and now this isn't the total sky height. It is a mean altitude, so this amount isn't necessarily going to be all the way up to the end of the troposphere, which is where all weather exists. So we can bring it down lower, and what I want to do is type in a value of 4 kilometers, and then the decay amount and the decay mean altitude, the height of the subtraction from the sky color with the decay color, I'm going to bring down to about halfway. So I'm going to use 2 kilometers. So we can start to see more of a blue sky. I am going to take the sky density, the ground density, and bring it down to 50%, which is overall going to darken the sky. And the sky itself is completely volumetric. So what we're really modifying is a volume. And because of this, once we reach certain values, if they're too high or too low, we're going to have a lot of grain. So we do need to pay attention to that throughout the editing. I am going to take the decay amount and bring it up to 80. So we're going to have 80%. And then the haze now needs to be reduced. I'm going to use a value, let's go ahead and use 1.4 kilometers. Haze is a huge lighting contributor to the scene, and is directly controlled and related to the ambient light color, which unfortunately has some great benefits, but some disadvantages to it as well. We'll take a look at that once we start modifying it, but really it should be part of the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab because the way it impacts the sky. It's one of the only color settings that is going to drastically impact the entire scene and not just the sky, but unfortunately it's impossible to achieve some effects without modifying the terrain to modify the sky. So we'll see that a little bit later. Since we're going to be creating more of an overcast sky by creating a storm, we also want to have more ambient light than sunlight. So I'm going to reduce the ambient slider in the light tab. Also going back to Sky, Fog, and Haze, I do want to increase the scattering of the overall sky and the lighting. And I'm going to bring that up to a little over 0.8. If you go up to 100, the glow intensity amount has absolutely no effect on the scene. So what we can do is limit the glow intensity, or the amount it is attracted around the sun, by increasing the amount and bringing it down to 0 is pretty much an equal distribution of glow intensity. Reducing it, going in reverse, is going to put more of the light behind what would be the camera right now, so kind of opposite the sun. And it's hard to tell with the atmosphere preview right now because of the way the exposure is set up. I'm going to bring the glow intensity to 26. So let's just take a quick look at how this is turning out. It looks a little too bright. There's a lot of atmospheric, really kind of blocking everything out. I'm going to go to the post-render options next to the save displayed picture, and I'm going to turn on the auto exposure, and hopefully that'll help balance things out. I also want to make a note about the natural film response. Natural film response is sort of a conversion from HDRI down to 8-bit, and what it does is kind of take sections from the more exposed areas and kind of steps them down a little bit more in order to produce a dispersed light that can be shown in 8-bit without really harsh lines. If you're going to have a scene or an atmosphere like you can see right now, where we have this really intense sunlight, it's just causing this really harsh line. And an HDRI image is going to look better and have it more spread out. But since we pretty much ultimately end up in 8-bit for final renders, and it's not just rendering out images to light other scenes, the natural film response can be really important to smooth it out. If you don't have this intense of a setup, you might not need the natural film response. But it is more difficult to take care of that in post for a really intense cutoff like the one we just saw. So I'm going to go back to the light, and I want to reduce the haze, just bringing that down to about 15%. And just do a preview render, and we can see that hasn't made a huge impact. One thing I can do is take the haze color, and we can actually bring that down to black. So RGB 0, and that is going to create a very large subtraction from the atmosphere and darken everything out, reducing the overall light amount. Let's take a look at the exposure. We can bring that down. We've got more of a high altitude looking shot where it gets darker, much darker on the top. For the most part, there's a better way to create this much darkness. So I'm going to take the haze color and bring it back. I want to stick with a non-specific color, so making sure that the RGB values are equal all the way across. And then I can start to change more towards another color once the overall scene is kind of balanced out. So we have a much better reduction now, still some of that glow. But I also want less blue overall, something a little more gray. But I think it's probably a good idea now to start with clouds and then start modifying the other settings, because they can have a very large impact on the look of a cloud. And we will need to make some modifications to the ambient light, which will also impact the clouds. So in the atmosphere editor, I'm going to click on the cloud tab and add in a cloud. And we can choose from the ones that are available with view. There's a Spectral 2 section that we're going to choose from because the conversion from a working Spectral version 1 cloud to a working Spectral version 2 cloud requires a lot of editing. Maybe we'll take a look at that a little later. just because some of the settings and the modifications to the filters as of view 8 make a big difference. So I do want to start with the dark cumulus preset. We're going to start from there and make it much better. There are a few settings that I like to use rather than the presets because they end up looking a lot better and help reduce grain. First off, before even rendering this, I'm going to reduce the height because we're not creating cumulonimbus clouds. I want to keep this fairly realistic. A 10-kilometer cloud is typically only found with cumulonimbus cloud, and that is still more rare because that would extend throughout the entire troposphere, and certainly wouldn't be spread out as much as this layer. But we will go ahead and just take a look at a quick render of this. So this is just a preview render, and we can already see a lot of grain showing, and in a final render or a better quality render, that grain is going to be very difficult to get rid of regardless of render settings. So what we need to do is modify the cloud to just kind of get rid of that because this is used to being a much larger volume because we did reduce the overall height, which changes cloud profiles and other settings. This is a very large layer, and I am going to go ahead and reduce the scale of the entire function and detail function to 0.6. We'll go ahead and start with that. And there are quite a few other settings to change, but I do want to show you just some of the steps along the way and what it's going to look like. So we can see just a smaller function, just reducing the overall size of the clouds. Now, storm clouds typically are stratus clouds, unless you get cumulonimbus for very intense storms. But typically, just normal rain clouds are going to be a stratus type cloud, which is a nimbus cloud. And we want to have a lower altitude because of that. Stratus clouds and cumulus clouds exist typically between 0 2 kilometers, sometimes up a little further. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce the altitude and start at 1 kilometer. So we're, in a sense, bringing this back to the scale it was before. So the closer we get to the camera, we may need to decrease some of the other scales, the material scale. And that's a real quick and easy way to take care of that. And another thing to keep in mind is the closer we get to the cloud, the more the detail layer we're going to see. So if the look is too rough, too grainy, it's not really going to work at that scale, and we need to reduce. So I am going to take the scale and bring it down to 0.4. Let's make some other changes as well. Ambient lighting for now, I'll just go ahead and reduce to 15%. And there's something else I really like to do. Sometimes it can cause a slightly longer render, but it's typically a cleaner render, and it's really going to be based on many variables of the scene, more specifically how much light has to be calculated to shine through the cloud. And what I like to do is, instead of using a dense, very dense volume, I reduce the density, go into the material, and edit the volumetric color instead, making it darker. If you go over to lighting and effects, I am going to turn off the force ambient light color, and I'm going to increase the height slightly, so a little over a kilometer high. I can already tell that this is too low. What we can do, if we want to see the height of the camera, if you click on the camera, we can see the height above the terrain or the object directly underneath it is 622 meters. If we want to know the overall position we have 683. So the height of that terrain underneath isn't very tall, and its position is above ground level by a bit. I do want to just go back, and I am going to increase the altitude of the clouds. We'll go ahead and do 1.8 kilometers and reduce scale to 0.2 for the material. With more of a balanced scale to the relation of the camera, distance to the cloud layer and the scene itself, roughness, we can see a different kind of grain showing now, which is more of a light-dark transition type grain. And what I want to do is increase the cover a little, and we're going to be modifying this function, increasing the detail amount. I want to reduce the feathers, increase opacity, which is really important. If the opacity amount's too low, the cloud will be very bright. We're going to go over to the color and density, and we can choose to modify the density production and create something custom. But I'm going to start by reducing that roughness amount and the scaling, bring down variations just to begin with. Maybe even going back, lifting the height. We have lost a little bit of detail. I'm going to go back and increase the roughness a little more and bring down scaling so that I have more towards roughness. We're going to use a value of 60 and then scaling at 25, edit the function, and what we can do is modify, create something custom. This setup is a basic repeater, which is basically an advanced noise node. It shows up under the fractal nodes, but it doesn't have the sort of roughness a fractal has, so it will render fairly quickly. It's a good starter for any sort of cloud sticking with noise or the basic repeater. You can, of course, use regular fractals. You just need to pay attention to the roughness. You also need to keep in mind which scale you want to use, whether you want, in this case where we have a bit of stretching along one of the axes, which is in this case the x-axis. Now, do we want to just scale the entire function or just the specific node? So this extra scale right here will modify everything contained within the density. I'm going to turn off the custom cloud layer profile and turn down the uniformity, and that's also going to help bring the cloud in a little bit more, create more of a stratus type look. And there's still a few roughness problems, which is mostly the height, and that's going to be fixable by bringing down the uniformity a little bit more, and then we can reduce the height and increase cover if needed, because we just want a flatter stratus layer. I'm also going to reduce the ambient lighting down to 7. So now we can see this shape fairly well. All we really need to do is increase the cover and increase the height. And then we can fill that in. So we're going to go up to the atmosphere editor, increase the cover, increase the height slightly, and if we want this to render a little faster, since this is going to be such a filled-in layer, we can also go into the function and change this from a basic repeater, selecting the fractal and checking noise over on the left. So it's going to create kind of the equivalent noise or something very similar. We just have a scale of 4.5. I'm going to go ahead and bring that up to 10, make it a little larger. And I'm just going to get rid of the offset. Increase roughness to 65. and we should have something a little more filled in. Some of the finer details, basically caused by the detail setting, I think are impacting it a little bit too much, and the scale, we're seeing a little bit too much in the back. So to get rid of that, I'm going to increase the aerial perspective slightly, bring it up to 1.5, increasing the density, which should block out some of those horizon clouds. And what we can do, going back to the cloud, I'm just going to bring the height up a little, a very small amount, but mostly decrease the detail amount, and then we can go into the scaling, bring it up a little higher. So we are slowly getting there. If you take a look, depending on the exposure you use, you can really create a different look for the scene in the clouds. Turn that down, it's obviously a lot darker. I do want to change the axis in which the clouds are stretching a bit, and bring this over to a different scale. So taking the function scale and the overall scale, setting them all to 1, and going into the gradient in the function, and changing the wavelength in here, where I'm going to go ahead and change the x to 2.2 and the y to 0.8. And then take the z, and if we want to have more layers within the layer, what we can do is reduce the wavelength to 0.5 to sort of double the amount of information. Make a couple more changes to the height, detail, reducing detail, increasing height. So now we have a fairly nice, pretty uniform stratus layer. What we really need to modify is the light.